Hello listeners, from Roy DeMar in Sam. I'd like to make a couple of comments before I return to the theme of the conquest of the East. A couple of comments about the financial situation and indeed the political situation in the US and then the UK. In the United States, the key impact of the tax cuts is that the deficit of the United States federal government is growing enormously, and so the issuing of bonds by the Treasury has gone up. The figure, for what it's worth, is that in Q2 this year, a total issuance of 73 billion is underway, and that includes quite a number of very short-term, what they call bills, because the bond is called a bill if its maturity is less than a year. And apparently they're issuing a lot of 2-month bills, which is very strange, but the reason is linked to the so-called money markets. Remember, the money markets have not functioned for many years because they do not offer any returns. Now, with the increase in the Fed rate on a quite regular basis, the money markets are actually worth putting money into when there's just need to put money away for just a month rather than years. And so this 2-month Treasury bill, to give it its proper name, is proving quite successful. Well, good for them. In the meantime, this idea of the ever-increasing debt and supply of Treasury bonds is disquieting in its own right. Remember that the QE process involved issuing bonds in a way, not to the public, but to the Federal Reserve Bank. And that stopped some couple of years ago now, but a number of bonds owned by the central bank, federal bank, remained high, but they're trying to reverse it. So imagine that we've got bonds which were issued 2, 3, maybe 5 years ago in the Federal Reserve Bank being offered to the public or to the investors at the same time as the government itself is issuing new bonds directly because it needs to cover these huge deficits created by the Trump tax cuts. Now, if something is offered in large amounts and the demand is not sufficient to take it up, then of course the price of that thing offered should drop, and that means that the yield on bonds is going up. And yet there are forces acting the other way. The forces acting the other way are in fact the poor performance of the economy, that companies are not really taking advantage of any sort of availability of money to reinvest in expansion. And that fight between the offers being so high, but opportunity to use money is being limited, has meant that there could now be a ceiling on the long-term rates for the bonds. That remains to be seen. As you know from earlier broadcasts, Harry Dent thinks that the 10-year rate can't go much above 3, or it has gone through 3 now, and it's going to be very interesting to see just what does happen at that long end. I remember when I worked or advised Bridport, we talked about dumbbell mixtures of buying bonds where it was either very short, part of the portfolio of bonds, and part long. That seems to make sense at the moment, because if you want to go lock in the 10-year rate at 3% because you don't think it's going to go any higher, now's the time to buy those bonds. On the other hand, at the short end, the bills, we've now got positive territory for a long time with the money market, so that's where some of the money can go anyway, while waiting to see what happens precisely at the long end. Well, that of course concerns only the United States Treasury bonds and corporate bonds, and just what's happening in Switzerland still remains to be seen. I'll have to come back to that because it isn't obvious that there is anything worth investing in terms of bonds or cash in this country because of the interest rates either being low or negative. I'd like to turn briefly to the United Kingdom and speak a bit about Brexit, because we have the extraordinary situation in that country where the opposition is weak and cannot actually stop the government doing anything, and so the government kind of has created within its ranks its own opposition, and we have this division now between the so-called hard Brexiteers who want nothing to do with Europe and the soft Brexiteers who say, well, it would be nice, for example, to stay with a customs union that would solve the Northern Irish border problem with the Republic of Ireland, and that we don't want to have a hard border there again because it only encourages the IRA and would go back to some sort of civil disturbance and killings and so on. One can understand the two sides of the argument. The main argument for staying in the customs union is, of course, the free movement of goods. Linked to that is the free movement of people, but they seem to have given way to that demand in the UK anyway, and so the main issue is, can we trade with the European Union without so much trouble? Because I've seen in Switzerland the difficulties. The idea that Switzerland's a good model is pretty discouraging, because I remember the case where I had to buy for a client with a Swiss company goods made in France but export them to England. We couldn't do it direct because we had no English company at the time. The goods had to come into Switzerland, we had to pay import duty and then re-exported, and that was so complicated. We got the import duty back, but it was nuts. The actual source of the goods was halfway to England anyway, and dragging it around the continent like that and filling in all these forms and paying was just a nightmare. If that's the way it's going to go between the UK and European Union, it's really, really bad news. One wants a flow of goods as easy as possible. So don't look to Switzerland as a good example of getting a free flow of goods. It just isn't there. The argument of the hard Brexiteers who want no particular arrangement with the European Union, want a complete break, is that this will give full freedom to the United Kingdom to negotiate deals with everybody else in the world. And there's been talk this week, for example, about Asia, the importance of Asia and the Pacific area, as well, of course, of talk of free trade with Canada again, calling upon the Commonwealth. And it all sounds very attractive. It just sounds also rather out of date. Well, we'll have to see what happens. I personally hope that they will stay in the customs union. And if you disagree with me, well, I'll just have to accept that you disagree with me or anybody else. We'll see what happens, to coin a phrase I think used by the American president. And now something a bit more light-hearted. Every week I'd like to add something about the conquest of the East, sometimes drawing parallels with the conquest of the West in the United States. And I've got to the point where the people were buying lots of furs from the sable from the indigenous tribes who lived beyond the Ural, and they're saying we want some of that action ourselves. And so we have individual trappers going there, but they soon proved inadequate alone, and so they would form whole groups of trappers who would go there for a long period, and they would both trap themselves and buy from the local tribes what the tribe people had already killed off in the way of fur-bearing animals, the sabre in particular, but also foxes and what have you. Now, these groups would build forts for trading and for protection, and I can see this parallel immediately with the forts that were built as the Americans moved west. But remember, it was later in history. We're talking about the 17th century, at least 100 years before the conquest of the West in the United States. Now, this idea of the individual trappers, perhaps epitomized by the Stroganovs, but not really only the Stroganovs, this trade soon became very attractive to the Moscow government. They would send agents to collect taxes from the indigenous people and ensure they got payment from them and from the fort people in furs. And so we've got this whole trading basis going on, not in rubles, but in furs. And indeed the bills tax bills were all expressed in number of furs of sabre of various qualities. Quite extraordinary situation that lasted a very long time. It comes as no surprise to learn that corruption was rife, that overcharging for tax was very common, that they had to change the envoys to pick up the tax very often because they would get sucked into the system and want to take some for themselves. So the picture of the colonialist really moving to the east and the relationship with the local indigenous people is not very attractive. They certainly did kill some local indigenous people, but of course it was nothing like the same scale as the Indian Wars in the USA. Although I've still got to remind myself and you that we're not talking about parallel time periods, because what was happening with the conquest of the East in Russia was an 18th century, end of 17th and 18th century phenomenon, whereas in the United States, of course, it was after independence and went into the 19th century. I'll continue to draw parallels where I can, but will gradually, as I read the book by Eric Hersley, there will be unfolded this movement to the east. Worth reminding you again, what made them move further east was simply that they wiped out all the sabre. If you can't catch anything anymore because you killed them all, then you have to move further and further away beyond the Ural. Speak to you again next week.